How long has Rituxan been out? It was approved in 1996, roughly, for lymphoma and ultimately rheumatoid arthritis. So it's been out.
Oh, that's one of the off.
That's an off-label use. You know, the argument that I would make for that drug is that our data suggests that if we do an induction phase with that drug where we give a gram of the drug twice, 2 weeks apart, and then give 500 milligrams once every 6 months, which is how rituximab is used, that actually is about half the cost or less of the other drugs that are currently available. And particularly once you get into the maintenance phase of 500 milligrams of this every 6 months, 1 gram of this drug is about $2,000 compared to, I was told yesterday that Tysabri is $60,000. Is that true?
I don't know.
And fingolimod is $40,000
a month.
Yeah, that's why I thought it was about 36,000. But I think they're actually, I think the people told me that we're looking at the published price list, and in medicine, the published price list is never what you pay unless you don't have insurance. It's always part of that, and so my understanding was about 36,000.
It's about
42. Well, you know more than I would.
Not 60.
Yeah, and then fingolimod, the last I heard, was still $48,000. So all the drugs are between $30,000 and $50,000, I would say right now. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah.
Okay. And so I think rituximab also is the only drug that has been shown with class 1 evidence to have benefit in patients with primary progressive MS. It was only in the group that were less than age 55, but still that's the group we want to treat based on the biology. And so I think that there's been an injustice to that group, that the field has sort of ignored that observation. The reason that happened was a psychological thing. It used to be that physicians focused most on the scientific literature to determine what therapies they were going to use. But peer pressure, legal pressure, and FDA regulations have now pushed us to be concerned about using anything that the FDA hasn't approved, even though about 40 to 50% of all prescriptions written in the United States are for off-label use. But it's old drugs, things that we've been using for years for other purposes. The newer biologics in particular, there's a lot of reluctance because of the cost and because of unknown risk to use them off-label. But in fact, in scientific literature, as I said, with rituximab, there are 5 nice studies, 3 that are large randomized trials that were not aimed at the FDA that still give us the information we need, just like the other drugs. And so this is a problem where the American healthcare system has not separated the regulatory issues related to companies, which is what the FDA was set up to monitor and to manage, versus the scientific evidence that patients and physicians need to use to make treatment decisions. And so insurance companies will routinely deny these expensive drugs if it's not approved by the FDA, even though we have scientific evidence that they can be useful. And this is particularly a problem if you have a rare disease like neuromyelitis optica or anti-GAD antibodies or Rasmussen's disease. These are rare diseases, 1 in 100,000 and 1 in a million people. No company's going to invest $1 billion for a drug that's only going to treat 1 in 100,000 people. So it's a really serious problem in healthcare, and that's why I'd like to see Drug and MS Center, National Society, and others continue to work to try to get some kind of mechanism set up where we could have a rational review process for off-label use. Yes.
Why not just put all patients on rituximab with such great results and such sustainability? Why not just...
It's socially unacceptable because it's not approved by the FDA. So the question is, why not put everybody on rituximab? Right now, and this is just my opinion, and I look at all the data, and because I have had this opportunity to sort of have inside information on all these drugs because these companies hire some of us who work in the field to come in and advise them on their use of the drugs. And the nice thing about that is that you get to hear a lot of data that's not published, and you get to have conversations that you wouldn't otherwise be able to have. So I've signed confidentiality agreements, and I can't go into those things in detail, but the fact is right now, if you look at the data that's available, the anti-CD20 therapies, so the rituximab and ocrelizumab and ofatumumab, there's actually about 5 anti-CD20s in development. Their safety data is remarkably good compared to how potent they are. Now, it's short-term data, so we have to get long-term studies. So it's just too early. This data hasn't even been published in most cases. One question I would say is a big debate right now that should be a more aggressive debate is why aren't we using Tysabri in patients if you're JCV antibody negative? There's not been a single case of PML in somebody negative on that blood test, and 45% of you are negative on that blood test. And once you remove the PML, the safety profile is the same as Avonex. It's a different risk, but it's the same magnitude of risk. And yet it's 2 to 3 times as effective and better tolerated. So physicians are, particularly neurologists, are by nature conservative. We're also obsessive and other things are not good, but
Controlling,
yeah, exactly. So the problem is this human psychology getting in the way of the data, because the data is there. It's been presented maybe a dozen times at different international meetings, and it's now being published. But it hasn't been published in detail in peer-reviewed journals just because their company's working with the FDA. But it's an issue, I think, that we have to come back and reassess the drugs based on what we really do know about them. And there's always uncertainties, but we really need to be more rational in our use of it. I would say that, unfortunately, the decisions are often still emotionally driven on the part of the physicians. It's what they're used to and what they're comfortable with. Yes, ma'am?
Are you more apt to be able to get one of the, like, on Tysabri, but if you, it seems like my first neurologist wanted to start me on a first-line drug. So if you've been on a first-line drug, do you have a better chance of getting into having therapy with a more, a stronger drug?
So the question is if you've been on a first-line drug, you have a better chance of getting to one of the stronger drugs. As I mentioned, from a regulatory standpoint, Gilenya was approved as a first-line drug. So from the FDA standpoint, you don't have to fail other therapies to get on it. But if you look at the package insert for Tysabri, it does state in there that, in general, patients will have failed other therapies, including interferons and glutarimer acetate. It says in general. The word in general was very specifically put in there to allow physicians to also make a decision that somebody had aggressive enough disease, they should just go directly to Tysabri. Now what I'm saying, though, is that the practice is lagging the science. We now have the science saying that 45% of you actually don't have a risk of PML. And even if you include the false negative rate, the risk is 1 in 30,000. Your risk of dying in a commercial airline is 1 in 20,000. Your risk of dying in a car accident is 1 in 164. So if you calculate the risks out, I mean, it is a risk. It's still theoretically, but it's theoretical because there's not been a single case. So that's the debate that needs to go on. And I think that patients and families need to participate in that debate because this data is available. You can get it. It's simply a matter of calculating the odds. So in medicine, we don't deal with truth. We deal with probabilities. We don't know what the truth is. All we know are relative risks and relative benefits. And oftentimes we don't know that well either, to tell the truth. But nevertheless, it's a matter of calculating your odds and trying to maximize your benefit and minimize your risk. That's the calculation that each patient has to do. And right now, that's a complex calculation. It's very individualized. Yes?
Have they looked at Rituxan at older than age 55?
So the question is, have they looked at Rituxan older than age 55? The answer is yes, particularly in the primary progressive study. And when we did the analysis, it was very clear that in patients over 55, we could not see an effect compared to placebo, whereas less than age 55, we could. And the problem is that from an FDA standpoint, it's a regulatory mandate that a study live or die based on what's called the primary outcome measure. So the investigators have to pick one measure and hope that that's the right one that's going to measure the drug effect and the right analysis. So even though there was a pre-planned subgroup analysis, so in other words, it wasn't data mining, it was a pre-planned analysis, it was defined in the protocol, and basically we asked the question, is it possible that rituximab will work in one age group and not in another age group? Because we had this suspicion that older patients wouldn't respond. And we built in the analysis to answer that, but because it wasn't the primary analysis, the FDA would not consider it. And unfortunately, physicians have been so indoctrinated by this concept that now they believe that you don't look at a study if it fails its primary. I would argue look at the data and you make the best decisions you can from that, given the world that we live in. In other words, it's a complex world and it takes complex problems. Yes?
I haven't heard you say very much about Rebif. What are your thoughts on?
So the question I haven't said very much about Rebif. Rebif is a member of a class of drugs, the interferons, of which we have 4 examples. I think only 4 now. Extavia, Rebif, Betaseron, and Avonex. The difference between them is only in 2 areas. One is in the dose that you get, and there is a partial dose-related response, and Rebif is one of the higher dose forms of the drug and has shown slightly higher efficacy than the Betaseron and Extavia, which are similar in dose range. But all 3 of those drugs have shown higher levels of efficacy than we see with Avonex. And the issue there is how you do the analysis. So there's a way that we do analysis in science called intent to treatment, which means you look at all patients regardless of what happens to them. And that's the most conservative way to look at a drug because it includes the people who don't do well or the people who drop out of the study. And when you look at that, the relative reduction relapse rate for Avonex is 18%, For Rebif, it's 30 to 32%. For Copaxone, 29 to 32%, depending on which study you look at. And Xtavia is around also about 30%. The issues with the interferons is that they do work. About 70 to 80% of patients tolerate them reasonably well. The major side effects are the flu-like symptoms and occasional skin necrosis issues and liver toxicities, although they're rare. And the biggest concern that we have is actually worsening depression with suicide. So even though we talk about PML and Tysabri, and I mentioned the 2 encephalitis cases with Gilenya, actually we had 2 to 3 excess deaths in the interferon studies, and they were much smaller studies. The current studies tend to have about 1,000 patients in them. When we did the studies with Rebif, Betaseron, Copaxone, there were between 250 and 350 patients total in the study. And we had 1 to 2 excess deaths due to suicide in the treated groups with interferons. And that was true for Rebif, and that was true for Betaseron. I don't remember in Avonex. So that's actually included in the warnings in the FDA labeling as worsening depression and suicide. So, you know, when I suggest that physicians compare the risk, they say, well, Tysabri's you can get PML. Well, you know, a serious adverse event is one that fundamentally changes your life, puts you in the hospital, or kills you. So suicide, I think, qualifies in that category. There's a question over here.